Welcome to Science Behind the Glass, where we explore how global decisions ripple through human lives and ecosystems. The current political climate is affecting every nation's decisions. And here at Science Behind the Glass, we believe that sharing knowledge, not panic, encouraging critical thinking about how the dismantling of the legal frameworks impacts not just diplomacy, but ecosystems, biodiversity, and the future of Earth. To help us unpack this, we honored to welcome Professor Gary Meyers, a legal scholar, constitutional expert, and the fierce defender of international law. Gary, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure having you here again.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
We want to know more about the current political climate that is affecting everyone's nation's decisions. And in Science Behind the Glass, we believe that sharing knowledge, not panic, encouraging critical thinking about how dismantling of legal frameworks impact not only just diplomacy, but ecosystems, biodiversity, and the future of Earth, basically.
Yeah.
So, with everything that is happening recently, but I think that it comes from quite way back.
Okay.
All that happening with the U.S., with Israel, we want to know recent events, like for example the invasion of U.S. to Venezuela, and everyone is speaking about the UN Charter and the violation of international law.
Yes.
Can you please explain to us in simple, plain words, what is the UN Charter, what does it mean, and why it's so important and so symbolic now? It became just so symbolic.
Sure. Well, the UN Charter is the fundamental document that underlies everything that the United Nations does. Okay, and it sets the tone for what is permissible and not permissible within the international community. As a treat, it is a treaty. Okay, and when you enter into a treaty with other countries, you do a couple of things. Most importantly, you agree to be bound by that treaty itself. Okay, so the provisions in the charter, for example, on the use of force, that in fact prohibit the use of force. Okay, you agree to be bound by that as a nation state. So, for example, I don't know whether to call it invasion, but anyhow, the attack on Venezuela, for example, is two things. One, it's a violation of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force or the threat of the use of force, and I'll come back to that one. In international relations, the use of force that threatens the political or territorial integrity of another country. But it's not as if, unfortunately, effectively in many respects, unenforceable. Unless I suppose Venezuela could go to the International Court of Justice and say, look, the U.S. violated the Article 2 of the UN Charter by attacking us, Venezuela, by bombing our ships and by bombing our ports and by kidnapping our president. So it's possible that aspect of the charter could be enforced in the International Court of Justice. More interestingly, the crime of aggression, okay, has now been recognized as a crime that entails that triggers the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And in this particular instance, in the Venezuelan case, for example, Venezuela is a member of the International Criminal Court. The U.S. is not a member, but both parties don't need to be members to have the International Criminal Court jurisdiction enforced. So the International Criminal Court then could indict probably Trump, the Secretary of Defense, in respect of its attack on Venezuelan territory, even its attack on Venezuelan ships, even though the U.S. is not a member. So Trump and the Secretary of Defense could both be indicted. They're unlikely to face the court, because the U.S. isn't going to turn the president over to the ICC, or are they going to turn over the Secretary of Defense to the ICC. But the important thing about the indictment is every member country of the of the of the court, okay, would then have to arrest and send to the court Trump or his Secretary of Defense if they traveled to that particular country. And that's why you see, for example, Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, they're not traveling anywhere. They travel to the U.S., they travel to China because China's not a member of the court, but they're not traveling in any respect to any Western country. So what was it, a year or so ago when they were talking about having a meeting in Hungary, and it was quickly canceled. Why? Hungary's a member of the International Criminal Court. And if Putin had showed up in Hungary, Hungary would have been obliged to arrest him and send him off to The Hague to face the jurisdiction of the ICC.
And I have a question, more like a background to give our audience like an understanding of the United Nations chart. So how this start, and the U.S. was part of this United Nations agreement, or they are part of this United Nations. How did it start? If I'm not wrong, was after the Second World War.
Yes. Well, generally speaking, the Allied powers, the U.S., the U.K., France, China, and Russia, thought it would be a good idea, and they gathered the other countries from around the world in San Francisco, and they had a bit of a talk fest for a couple of years. And we got the UN Charter, and like I said, one of the most important provisions is the provision in the Charter, in Article 2, I think it's Article 2, Paragraph 4, that prohibits not just the use of force, but prohibits the threat of the use of force. Okay, so now let's think, what does that mean? Okay, hey, Greenland, I'm coming to take you over. That's a threat of the use of force, and it's clearly unlawful under the UN Charter. So, you've got another one, and there's one more. You've got another one that could trigger International Court of Justice. A second one that could trigger the International Court of Justice is sending a flotilla of Navy vessels off the coast of Iran and saying, Iran, you will do X, Y, and Z, or you're in big trouble. That's threat of use of force. You can't do that. You can't do that.
As the U.S. is part of the United Nations, or was. So if they are violating the UN Charter,
yes,
who enforces this charter? Because it's like the idea is avoiding escalating a huge conflict. Then the purpose is like avoiding exactly what the US is doing, right? Like they're bullying the other ones, threatening for example, what he's doing with Greenland, or you don't do this, we impose also tariffs. That is another way of imposing or bullying the other nations. So how the UN, what are the tools that they have to enforce this?
Well, that is a slightly complicated answer, or a complicated question. Maybe I'll try and make the answer reasonably simple. Member nation of the UN could, in fact, file a claim in the International Court of Justice, arguing that the U.S. has violated the UN Charter. Okay, and that would invoke the whole process of the hearing in front of the International Court of Justice. The difficulty with that one is that the U.S. would probably not, even though by joining the UN they've effectively consented to be bound by the decisions of the ICJ. The ICJ itself has a provision in its own rules that allows a country to decline jurisdiction. So the U.S. would probably decline to be there. It's done that in the past. The famous case, U.S. versus Nicaragua, the U.S. mined the Nicaraguan harbors. Nicaragua took the U.S. to the International Court of Justice. The U.S. didn't even show up. The court found in favor of Nicaragua, and the U.S. Said, well, we're not abiding by any ruling. So that one, so it's a difficult proposition there. You could do it. It could be good PR, but the U.S. isn't going to show up. Okay. The normal route in a situation like this would be for the Security Council of the UN to take up the issue of violation of the Charter. Security Council resolutions are law. Declarations by the UN General Assembly are just sort of persuasive of what the international community thinks is a good idea or is law. The problem there is that the U.S. is one of the 5 original founding members of the UN, and along with China, Russia, the UK, and France, has a veto in the Security Council itself. That means you could take everything to the Security Council and you could get a vote of 14-1, 14 countries, and then 1 country saying no, and that would be the U.S. The motion doesn't pass. I mean, it's complicated and it's messy, and that's I think.
But it's like saying, for example, okay, we are in a table sitting all together, and then we agree that there is not going to be aggression. We just, put some rules in place to try to avoid
Yeah,
escalation of
yeah,
aggression and all this that is happening. But then if I violate that, it's like, but that rules don't play for me
yeah,
because I don't want to
yeah,
take it. And
yeah,
I don't want.
yeah.
So it's like that. So there is more like a formality.
Uh, but it's Animal Farm in operation. Okay, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Okay, and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are more equal than the other members in that respect. The General Assembly has the power to expel a member or suspend a member, but it needs the permission of the Security Council to do so. So everything keeps coming back to the Security Council.
How can it be changed? Because we are seeing that this is like they are abusing the power and being part of the board, but not committed to do to if make a mistake and I'm failing to accomplish with this law. So what rules that we establish? How this can change? Do you think that it needs update the security board, or how, or what is the next step? What is us the message that is us sending to everyone is just I don't know, like a rolling out or putting out uh, down the UN.
Yeah, you would have to have those 5 members, those 5 permanent members of the Security Council, agree to get rid of the veto and replace it perhaps with something like a supermajority. 15 members sit on the Security Council, maybe to pass a resolution. If you get rid of the veto, maybe to pass a resolution, you've got to have 10 in favor. Maybe you've got to have 12 in favor. I don't know. But, somehow you've got to have those 5 members say, we're getting rid of we're getting rid of the veto. And once you're rid of the veto, then the UN could operate like your basic legislature around. If you get a majority, supermajority, fine, 2/3, 3/4, whatever you want, but no veto. That fundamental change would mark a huge difference in the way that the UN operates.
The other problem that has US now is the defunding that US is doing, right? So they are not funding, or they just remove all the funding of more than 75%
Yeah,
of the funding.
yeah.
That what does it mean? Is it going to be dismantled completely because they are now in crisis, and then it needs to change the strategy? How the UN works? Because I don't think that a lot of people say it's it's like a wolf without
Yeah.
two teeth. So
No, it's not. I don't think it's going to get dismantled in any way, shape, or form. Because look, it's temporary. For another 3 years while Rumpy's in office, you're going to have problems. And and we've had this in the past. You have to you don't have to think back too far. During his first term, there were a number of withdrawals of funding as well from particular organizations like UNESCO, because they don't like what UNESCO does. It's sort of interference. It promotes sort of education, science, culture, kids, women, what have you. No, we don't want that. And so it's happened before, and it's even happened before the first administration of this current occupant of the Oval Office. So, next person in office will probably change that and refund the UN to all of its levels. And it's not unusual for nation states in some respect to be late with their dues across the board. It happens. It happens. But I'm not worried about losing the UN. I think I'm more concerned about what's happening just sort of currently and how long it's going to happen. I'm beginning to see signs in the U.S. of at least some Republicans pushing back on some of this stuff, because it's just messy. You can't have. The news this morning: the U.S. and India just signed basically a free trade deal, okay? And all of the tariffs that had just been imposed against India because India was buying Russian oil are gone. So those tariffs existed for what, a month? That sort of transactional, he's been described as a transactional president. And he is. Nothing's permanent. Nothing is related to legal obligations. It just happens. But now it's gone. No more tariffs against India. They've got a free trade agreement.
Yeah. Also, recently with the vice president of Venezuela, she's the one now in charge of the country temporarily.
Correct.
U.S. is imposing over them how they have to manage their resources, specifically oil. But this is also part of the bullying. It shouldn't be allowed how the sovereignty is, how they run their own country. So what of measures should be taken or with possibly to be taken to avoid this happening?
That one was really, really, really messy, because we don't really have any idea of what level of management the U.S. is exercising over Venezuela's activities, its natural resources. We've got some idea of what it's doing with the oil, but it's not particularly clear. And again, one of the fundamentals of being a nation state is the capacity to manage your own natural resources, and that's in the UN Charter. And I don't teach international law again until the end of the year, but when I was teaching it last year in October, November, what have you, I kept saying to the students, look, it's just messy, and it isn't easily fixable. And there's no, you and I go out and commit a crime. There's a police force there. They come and they get us, and then they take us to court. We don't get to say no to the police. When the court sends us a summons to appear there, we don't get to say no to them. In international law, you get to do that, in part because there's no police, and in part because, the court has no capacity to force you to turn up. Neither one of them. Neither the ICC or the ICJ has the capacity to enforce you to turn up.
Do you think that this should change, how they are enforcing this? And how can be changed?
How can we change it? How can we change it? Like I said, I think the change begins with the change in that veto. Get rid of the veto, then almost anything is possible. And I don't care what the supermajority is. I mean, you could, it could be 12 out of 15. That's fine. I don't care. Because most of the time you would get 12. Well, maybe it's better to have 10. Because if Russia and China and the U.S. all vote together, then you've got a problem. You're right down to 12. So it gets a little bit tricky. That's the fundamental change that has to be made. In terms of the ICC, the ICC struggles, and it struggles in part because it's a court of complementarity. In other words, The international criminal law is supposed to be enforced by the country where the crime takes place. Okay. And it's only when that country is unable or unwilling to send someone to the court that the court acquires effective jurisdiction. And then it's a matter of, perhaps a new administration. You've got a new administration in the Philippines. The former president of the Philippines is now in the ICC. That's because the new president in the Philippines said, we're going to send Duterte there, despite the fact that his daughter is now the vice president in the Philippines. So you need the country that has jurisdiction over the individual to determine that, yes, we're either going to try this individual or we're going to send this individual to the ICC. So if you look at the various, you can go to the International Criminal Court and look up indictments, for example, okay? And you can see who is currently being indicted or in the past as well. And you look down that list, and in many of the instances, it says at large, at large, at large, at large. In other words, that person is somewhere, probably in their own country or another friendly country. And, they can't get at it. And I suspect I suspect there's no way to change that.
Yeah, that's very complex.
It is complex. It is complex.
A weeks ago in Davos, I think that it was like Economic World Forum. Trump launched the Board of Peace, a new
The
initiative.
Board of Peace.
Yes, a new initiative originally linked to Gaza reconstruction, new pitch as a broader peace mechanism that actually has a high fee.
Yeah. I did take a few notes. The Board of Peace is a U.S.-led organization established by Trump. He's the chairman, okay, with the stated purpose of peacekeeping around the world, and particular in overseeing the process in Gaza. Okay. He sent out invitations to others to join the Board of Peace. So far, not a large number of takers. There's some takers, including one. I think it might have been
Including
Indonesia.
Israel, Netanyahu accepted.
Yeah. He's accepted, and a couple of others have. What is it? The current right-wing president of Argentina, I think.
Yeah, Milei.
Yeah, I think he has accepted, and there are a few others. We haven't heard anything from the UK. We haven't heard anything from France. We haven't heard anything from Canada. Australia has been offered a spot, and our current prime minister hasn't accepted that spot yet. So we'll see about the Board of Peace. It seems to me I saw what was it? I saw a video the other day, and the video showed Trump's son-in-law, Kushner, standing in front of a projected view of what Gaza would look like in the future. And it was all of these fantastic, almost science fiction like high-rise buildings.
Without the Palestinians.
Yeah. I don't think, I didn't see any Palestinians in the picture. I think the Palestinians have all been, can you guys move to Egypt or something like that? But no, there wasn't. So, look, the Board of Peace is just another mechanism for Rumpy and his family to make a few bucks. A lot of bucks, in fact.
Yeah, because he has a high fee to join.
Yeah, I think it was, I think this projected plan for rebuilding Gaza was something like $50 billion. It's a lot of money,
This is not like compared to the United Nations terms or legitimacy and authority.
Yeah. It's not going to replace the UN. And interestingly enough, the Security Council actually passed a resolution welcoming the Board of Peace. But I think the understanding of the Board of Peace was that the Board of Peace would be specific to Gaza without getting it involved in any of the other conflicts, particularly, for example, the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine.
But this is not undermining more the UN And also, well, the ICC, because
Yeah,
actually Netanyahu
yeah,
was the ICC
yeah.
declared
Well,
him.
yeah, he's got Netanyahu's got 5 indictments. I think 3 for crimes against humanity and 2 for war crimes, or vice versa. I can't remember which way it went. Putin's got 2. And like I said, that's, they're not traveling. You don't see Putin traveling outside. He goes to China, he can go to North Korea if he wants to. He can come to the U.S. and talk to his buddy Don. But that's about the only place he can go. And you don't see Netanyahu traveling outside of the U.S. either. It's just not happening. Um, it it will dissolve at some point in time. I don't understand why the Security Council went ahead and sort of endorsed it, unless they were just thinking, oh, limited. Yeah, let's rebuild Gaza. Let's use this Board of Peace thing. And Trump is the chairman of this thing, and it looks like a company. And the next thing you know, they're going to make billions of dollars out of trying to rebuild Gaza. And, the indictments against Putin are a number of years old. Even the indictments against Netanyahu are a number of years old. And I think the court, the ICC, has just given up, because you could indict Netanyahu almost every day for a war crime. It's just a series of war crimes, one after another, after another, after another. Yesterday's, or the day before, I think yesterday's, was an attack on a civilian bus that was taking 20 miners to a mine. Why blow up a bus that's taking 20 miners to a mine? 70,000 dead there, almost a third of them children, more than 20,000 kids. And it's just, one war crime after another. It's just incredible. And the Ukraine's almost as bad. The targeting of civilian installations, civilian buildings, apartment buildings, power stations, all of that stuff is a war crime. And the ICC, I think, well, we've got 2 indictments here. We got 5 over here. There's not much more we can do. We could sit around and indict these people every other day.
How needs to enforce or change it, because nothing is happening and changing. They are doing whatever they want, and the idea is like that nobody pronounce, or the European Union doesn't say anything. Nobody keep it very quiet. They don't make like a remarks, or they don't do any remarks directly to what is happening. They just completely change. It's like, oh, just not the news anymore. But actually, this is continuing escalating. So, and and then together with this, like continue with these countries that already reject or haven't signed the Board of Peace. Do you think that is a sign of dividing the global community about how peace should be pursued and how it gets lead that conversation? Do you think that this is more about how actually the things had to be done, like undermining the what is the efforts that have been done? Do you think that it's necessary to change things to work properly because the UN and the ICC don't have the tools to actually pursue this?
Well, they have the tools, they just can't use them. And like I said, I mean, that, like, we've talked about the Security Council veto. That's got to go. That's the most important thing that the international community could do, is pressure those permanent members to give up that veto and change that for a supermajority. In terms of the ICC, interestingly enough, in my view, I think that both Trump and Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and probably the admiral that launched that attack on a ship that had already been sunk, basically, and there were a couple of folks hanging on to what was rubbish in the sea, and then he went ahead and bombed them again. Look, that's a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions on the rules of war. You don't do that. You're supposed to rescue people, whether they're on land or at sea. But look, you might include the Secretary of State, although his relationship to all of this stuff is less direct than Trump through the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as he's calling him now. But I would, if I was the ICC, I'd indict them, both of them. for their attacks on Venezuela. And then, okay, with that indictment, then Trump can't travel and Hegseth can't travel in any country that is a member of the ICC, because then they're obliged to arrest him and put him away or send him off to The Hague. So that's all of Western Europe. And then most of South America, certainly all of North America. You couldn't travel to talk to the president of Mexico, for example. So most of the world would be off limits. And that would seriously confine his ability to go. For example, he was just at the World Forum, the Davos World Forum. He couldn't have gone to the Davos World Forum because that country would have been required to arrest him and turn him over to The Hague. So I'd go ahead and indict him and, put the pressure on.
Yeah, and recently I was reading that actually Trump and his administration were trying to impose like a pressure over the ICC to avoid this indictment.
Yeah.
So how is possible that he has to say it is not even part of the?
He doesn't have to be part of the ICC for an indictment to occur.
If he is not part of that and to be indicted, but why he can bully the ICC or threaten them if they impose sanctions over the country and over Trump?
I don't think that's particularly problematic. I don't think Iran is a member of the ICC. I'd have to go back and check. Venezuela is, though. So, you've got one country that's a member, one country that's not a member. You don't need both countries to be a member because the attack occurred in Venezuela, and the indictment could go forward. And I think it probably should. And like I say, and that would limit the capacity of these people to travel most places around the world.
That's very insightful. I don't think that no everyone knows about that.
I don't think anybody's thinking about it. Again, I don't know what would happen if the ICC indicted the U.S. Secretary of Defense or indicted the U.S. President. I think it'd be a good thing for all of us if they did.
Yeah, that's true. I'm changing a little bit, but not much of the topic. How these treaties, environmental treaties, and how these get affected with everything that is happening in this moment.
Yeah.
Because, for example, Trump removed U.S. from the Paris Agreement of climate change. For him, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then he did it again.
Well, yes, he did. Twice. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they can rejoin again.
Yes. But then he's also tried to ease the law related to Environmental Protection Act in his own country.
Yes.
And also trying to breach other laws that are already imposed.
Yes.
How this is affecting not only U.S., but other countries.
I mean, I haven't seen it. I don't really think any other countries, they care because particularly about climate change. I mean, the two biggest climate change polluters are the U.S. and China. Okay. And that's significant. And so if the U.S. is able to, and China's to some extent trying to move forward and into alternative energy sources. Interestingly, I mean, the U.S. is actually making progress in that area because states like California and other Pacific Coast states, some East Coast states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, et cetera, are doing their own. California is rapidly becoming almost a net zero state in terms of energy use. Which is good, but we do need those two largest polluters, and the EU is moving ahead very, very rapidly as well. They've got trains that run on solar energy, for goodness sake. They're burning trash for power. They're recycling tires for pavement instead of using asphalt. And they're getting rid of the tires by putting them down as pavers, as opposed to, putting them in a landfill or trying to burn them up. So the EU is fantastic. It's moving pretty dramatically. Australia is not doing too bad.
It's a slow transition, I could say.
Yeah,
Very slow.
yeah, but it's not doing too bad. Um, but as a polluter, Australia is 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Even if you throw in the coal that Australia produces and sends to other countries, you're talking 3.5 to 4%. So I suppose if Australia stopped mining coal, then those other countries wouldn't be able to burn coal. I don't know what they do for power, but they have to do something. But no, the other thing to remember across the whole number of issues that we're looking at, the current administration in the U.S. is temporary. It's temporary, and it's probably more temporary than just the end of a 4-year presidential term. I suspect that everything indicates that the midterm elections coming next November are going to put a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress. Everything leans that way, and and then in many respects, the president is stymied. And in fact, I mean, the whole system could just go nuts because nothing might get done. You could have Congress passing legislation and the president refusing to sign it, and then it would come back to Congress, and unless you got your 2/3 veto-proof majority, then you get no legislation. So it could be a giant stalemate in 2 years. Lord knows what will happen in 4 or 3 when we have the next election.
What would you recommend people with all this news, all this panic, all this misinformation? What would you recommend to people to read, to precise the critical thinking? Where would they look for information?
Information. Well, that's a tough one. Hopefully people out there can look and see us and know that we're not AI. Uh, People, if you're watching, I am not an AI. I don't like AI. I refuse to use AI. I conscientiously object to AI, but you got to be careful. I think you have to go to your most reputable sources for information. If you're interested in international law, go to the UN site. It's pretty good in terms of providing, direct and clear information. And you've got some really outstanding news organizations out there. SBS is excellent. In the US, the public broadcasting system is excellent. And in fact, it's so good that the Trump administration is pulling federal funding out of the public broadcast system. That's how good they are. But look, they'll survive, and they'll do well because the public supports the PBS system. You just got to find reputable sources for your information.
We're going to put some resources, the
Yeah.
people. Yeah, we will put in
You sort of got to jump around too. I mean,
yes.
I'm in Australia. We've got SBS; they're very good, and we even get Al Jazeera. And despite it being Al Jazeera, they're actually pretty good.
Yes.
They're thorough. Now, do they have a bias? Yeah, they probably have a bias.
I
But
think that all of them had bias.
yeah. But the reporting is at least thorough and largely factual. Largely factual. Well, not too. And I think that's where you go.
Yes. And also to finalize, what gives you hope that diplomacy, justice, or shared humanity can prevail? What gives you hope with everything that is happening?
Well, I actually think, despite all the stuff that's going on, there are actually some hopeful signs. I mean, both Canada and the UK have gone off to China to develop new relationships with China. Now, the UK's adventures in China are not nearly as significant as China's. China and Canada are becoming, reasonable economic partners. And there's some stuff that Canada is just turning away from the U.S. and saying, we can do that in China. We can do it with Chinese products. By all means, we don't need U.S. cars. China, please send us some cars and some of those lovely SUVs that you're making. And I think that's a good sign. Despite the fact that the EU has not really committed a lot of, not prepared to commit troops at this point in time to Ukraine. They probably should, and just severely push back. They're at least committed to commit security forces once some form of peace agreement is set. Okay. But the other thing that the EU has done is say, oh, look, sorry, US, you're not coming to Greenland. No way are you coming to Greenland. And in addition to just saying, you're not coming to Greenland, the UK, Germany, France, Norway, and I think one other country have already sent military of one sort or another to Greenland to assist in any sort of defense of Greenland. Germany, I think, sent 2 naval vessels. So that response is pretty critical, and it says, say, look, Denmark is NATO, and you don't mess around with NATO. And I think the pushback, even the pushback from the Republican Party, particularly in the Senate, has said, sorry, dude, get your hands off of NATO and quit messing around with, what has been our essential line of defense for the last, 80 years. So I think there are good signs out there. On a daily basis, that doesn't mean that he can't do something stupid, and that has an impact on all of us. I wouldn't go hopeful. I'd like to hope I could be hopeful.
That's true. Let's see what happens.
Yes, we will. We will, indeed.
Thank you very much, Gary,
Oh, it's
for
been my
sharing
pleasure again. I
with
always
me.
enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yes, it's fantastic. Thank you for everything and for sharing your knowledge and updating people.